What if Garm's binding spell was successful against the evil demon Scorn? Could Garm take over the world, or would his pride be his downfall once again? Our story begins in Garm's citadel, on the western reaches of the Temporal Zone. It has only been a few months since he departed from his brother's side. The young mage Garm paced back and forth in his chambers, his last encounter with Sumner looping in his mind. Sumner didn't want his brother to leave. They may have not agreed on everything, but Sumner did care for him. In the moment, Garm didn't pick up on his brother's cues of compassion, but as the conversation plagued him, he thought he may have detected a hint of an underlying message. Just maybe. Garm slumped down to his throne in an unnatural yet temporarily comfortable posture. A small part of him wanted to return and apologize to the Elder Wizard, but his pride couldn't help but remind him of the nagging and the finger-wagging. Every time he rose to confront Sumner, he always found himself turning around even before reaching the stone doors of his bedroom. For the first time in months, Garm asked himself a new question. Why was he so fixated on Sumner? He spent the last several years daring himself to leave, and now that he had actually done it, Sumner continues to torment him. It didn't make sense, and Garm could recognize that. Garm sat up straight, took a deep breath, and glided his eyes around the stone walls that surrounded him. He didn't need Sumner. He had his own tower now, 15,000 strong and loyal men, and he could practice whatever and whenever he wanted. A smirk formed on his face as another thought crossed his mind. Whenever Garm tapped into something new, Sumner always condemned it. He would tell Garm that the powers of the underworld had no place in his tower, and how the darkness was easier but never stronger. If that was true, why did Sumner fear it so greatly? If he was all-powerful, why hide from it? Why not control it? His smirk was now a full-on crooked smile, a look in which Sumner was all too familiar. If Sumner wasn't going to control it, he would. Garm sprang up as the idea began to deep blur in his mind. Garm recalled to a moment in his youth involving the runestone circle. The arch-wizards had just concluded another petty dispute when Garm stared into the yellow vortex that sat between the magic stones. In his subconscious mind, Garm could have sworn he felt eyes staring back at him through the veil. He didn't think much of it at the time, but he came to remember it greatly over the years. Whatever it was dark, it was powerful. It was exactly what he needed. Garm had yet to encounter a spirit he couldn't overpower. He couldn't imagine the presence in the portal would be out of his league. Garm expected resistance from it, but nothing he couldn't handle. As Garm fetched his staff, he was pretty confident he could connect with the presence. All he had to do was focus on what he remembered. Surely this wouldn't be too hard. Garm stepped outside, the sun reflecting off his red and purple garbs. After about 3 steps, Garm found himself standing still. Doubt flooded his thoughts. Despite his arrogancy, Garm was a truly powerful warlock, arguably one of the best of his time. But what if it wasn't enough? If Sumner really did fear black magic as much as he believed, maybe there was a reason. Sure, Garm had dabbled in dark arts since his emancipation from Sumner, but he had never truly encountered a spirit on a level like this. Garm was pretty confident he could handle it, but the idea that he couldn't made him stop in his tracks. He forced himself to brush off those negative thoughts as he began to walk towards Sumner's tower. As he approached, his anxiety screamed louder and louder for him to turn back. Despite these thoughts, his legs continued to trudge forward. He found himself using the majestic woodlands of the Temporal Zone to relax his nerves. He took periodic stops along the way, more than he needed in truth. Despite the excellence of his master plan, he was in no hurry to get there. By the time he reached the base of his rival's tower, the sun was beginning to vanish over the horizon. Garm was expecting to feel Sumner's presence as he approached, but to his fortune, he felt nothing. Sumner was out for the evening. The stars had aligned for him. This was his chance. Taking Sumner's absence as a universal sign that he was destined for this, any doubt regarding his abilities had vanished. Garm was left in total darkness as the tower doors slammed behind him. The smell of the chalky air in the stairway flashed more memories in his head, solidifying his motivations even further. When he reached the central tower chamber, he lit the 2 lamps adjacent to Sumner's lectern. The lighting was still poor, but nothing that would hinder the ritual. The spirit would probably appreciate the moody atmosphere anyway. Garm leaned his staff against the wall and approached the empty stone circle. The 13 runestones sat invitingly in a pile to the ring's left. Garm picked up the purple catalyst stone and stared into its emblem, his power coursing through his nerves. Before Garm could recall his runestone knowledge, he was slammed with a vision. He saw himself placing the final stone in the circle, smoke pouring from the gateway as a monstrous figure emerged from the darkness. Garm went white as the magnificent being stared down at the puny ant that had brought him forward. Through his terror, Garm was able to admire the demon in all his glory. He was omnipotently powerful and beautiful in every way to him. Oh yes, if he could control this spirit, nothing would ever come to oppose him. Why stop with Sumner? With Scorn by his side, Garm could rule the entire world. The realms would be his forever. However, Garm's pathetic attempt at a binding spell was lost in the black hole that was Scorn's power. Garm could only scream as Scorn's fist slammed onto the defenseless mage. As Garm was jolted back to reality, the catalyst stone fell to the floor, cracking the carved floor with a loud thump. Garm sprang backwards, falling to the floor. He sat there visibly shaking as doubt once again silenced his pride. He could not let that happen. His plans to use this being to control the world were very much still intact, but he needed to be certain without a shadow of a doubt that he could control this dark presence. Garm stood up, took a deep breath, and collected his staff. He thought for a moment. Garm was fairly familiar with the concept of archdemon, but prior to his vision, he had no reference to determine the exact extent of their power, nor did he know the particular spirit he was infatuated with was indeed of such lineage. Garm needed to learn everything he could about whatever entity it was that he was dealing with, and he had a pretty good place in mind to start. Garm collected himself once more and made his way to the Twinian town section of the tower. Garm was familiar with the Reaver cult of Haines Haven, but he had never personally encountered them. For his time with Sumner, he understood their magic practices used blood and hatred as a source, a stark difference from the Magi's strict light-based teachings, or even the witch's morally gray necromancy magic. Garm was the only known wizard that did not use the light element in any regard in his magic. Garm believed this made him a better mage more than anyone in the Magi or the Coven. This was true to an extent, as most mages could not just conjure a spell without tapping into an external power source. In their waiting time together, Sumner had tried to express to Garm that if he combined his raw abilities with an element, he would likely be on par with Sumner himself. Garm always rebuked this line of thinking, but he re-asked himself the question on the way to the warp gates. Garm's pride was screaming at him that giving in to Sumner's teachings made him weak, but if the light element was the key to conjuring the world, so be it. He wasn't sure if the cult knew how to control demons, but they could probably point him in the right direction. Within the hour of Garm's departure to Twinian Town, Sumner returned to his tower. It didn't take him long to realize that Garm had been there during his absence. While Sumner understood Garm was selfish, arrogant, and even foolish at times, he didn't believe his brother would truly do anything rash. Sumner believed Garm had broken into the tower in order to steal a book or use a rune stone or use a warp gate to one of the realms. This was a fair assessment, as Garm had done just that in the past. Had Garm simply asked, Sumner would be more than welcome to share in his asset and his insight into whatever Garm was facing, but he knew Garm's pride would never allow him to do such a thing. Sumner certainly didn't encourage Garm to break into his tower, but he would allow Garm to play vigilante if it made him feel better. Garm might have believed he was getting back to the old man, but he really wasn't. While Garm would never truly see it, his disdain for his brother was never mutual. Most of the villagers in Twinian Town had settled in for the night, and the ones that hadn't paid Garm little notice. The witches were always meeting strangely dressed men from faraway lands, so the villagers weren't too alarmed by a stranger's exotic robes, nor his oddly groomed facial hair. In fact, most of the villagers were more disturbed at each other at the moment. Apparently, some whackjob pretending to be the Grim Reaper butchered an entire family the evening prior, and the town's mayor was also hung in a public uprising over some tax policy or something like that. Garm would never come to know of these events, however. Garm knew the village of Haines Haven was to the north, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was on the map, so he went into the tavern to ask for directions. Garm never really understood the purpose of such social hotspots like bars and taverns, but he understood that news and gossip tended to float around these places. The Broken Piano, Inn and Tavern was the oldest building in town, if you exclude the church and mausoleum. As Garm took a seat on one of the rickety bar stools, he took a moment to examine the interior. Under any other circumstances, Garm would never expose himself to such vulgar display of public filth, but if it meant he could rule the world, even his pride didn't understand that. In honesty, the tavern was quite well kept in comparison to most pubs in the region. The bearskin rug on the floor was well combed, the windows free of dust, and, ironically, the piano by no means was broken. Quite the opposite, in fact. The tavern keep, a middle-aged bald man with a wooden hand, quietly passed Garm a paper menu. The bar was empty, and according to the rack of keys behind the tender, so were the rooms upstairs. Garm boldly stated he required directions to Haines Haven, causing the man to chuckle. He told Garm it was his funeral, and grabbed a crude map from under the counter. He circled Twinian Town and Haines Haven on the map and pointed out which roads he should take. Garm placed a single gold piece on the table, pocketed the map, and left without another word. After about a day's walk, Garm would find the village, but he wouldn't have to search for the Reavers. As he traversed the haunted forest that surrounded the village, a dark presence began to surround him. It wasn't nowhere near as strong as Scorn, but it was of similar nature. 3 men dressed in yellow and black robes and armor sprung from the woods and ambushed the arch-wizard. Garm was quick to whack the first one with his staff, as the third fired a yellow skull. It was similar to the Demon Skull spell used by the Desert Magi, but this was rooted in hatred and darkness. Garm couldn't help but marvel at it as he absorbed it with his own magic. The second Reaver threw a magic chain around Garm's waist and attempted to charge it with dark magic. This plan quickly backfired as Garm sent his own purple lightning through the chain, shocking the mage into submission. The other 2 were quick to follow as Garm blasted them with his signature purple bolts. The mage with the chain was quick to plead for mercy from the evil wizard. In other circumstances, Garm would have likely turned these 3 to ash for even considering attacking him. However, if anyone could teach him to bind Scorn, it was this group. Garm introduced himself and his desire to understand demons. He did not mention his plan to take over the world or destroy Sumner. The mage with the chain introduced himself as Caniva, leader of the Dark Circle, a division of the Reaver cult that specialized in blood magic and demonology. Garm was instantly intrigued by this character. This clan was more isolated than most of the Bannerlord, and were not familiar with Garm's name. They knew of Sumner, but not Garm. Caniva quickly took a liking to Garm, and was honored to teach him their spells. Caniva would introduce Garm to the rest of the Dark Circle and grant him access to the Coffin Vaults. There were a series of tunnels that connected the cult's sanctums. Some of the mages argued that Caniva was too trusting of this stranger. Even Caniva recognized their point, but none of them had ever encountered a mage as powerful as Garm, and if he truly wished to learn their ways, he could be the best of them. The fact that Garm didn't use an element really sealed the deal for Caniva. If he could best them, wielders of light-based blood magic, all on his own with no elemental assistance, it means Garm could potentially be the strongest blood mage ever. Over the course of the next several months, Garm would take periodic visits to the Coffin Vaults to practice demonology with the Dark Circle. Some of the other Reavers in the cult would come to take notice of Garm's visits, but it never truly concerned any of them. If Caniva trusted him, who were they to question his judgment? Due to Garm's pre-existing darkness and understanding of magic theory, he was extremely quick to master the teachings of the sub-blood doctrine of the light element. In return for learning spells such as Door to Hell and Bend Will, Garm taught Caniva and the higher mages some of his own spells. Nothing crazy, but nothing that the Magi would have taught them either. As the weeks went on, Caniva and Garm began to confess more and more to each other. At no point would they consider each other friends, but Garm was comfortable by Caniva's presence. And when we're talking about Garm, that's as good as you're gonna get. Caniva confessed his upbringing in Twinion Town and reasonings for succumbing to the darkness. At first, Garm told him that he was only interested in learning light sub-blood because of an encounter he had in his youth staring into the Runestone portal. While the story was true, it wasn't really the reason he wanted to become a blood master. With each of their meetings, more and more of Garm's plan began to slip through the cracks of their conversations. When Caniva directly asked Garm if he had intent on summoning and controlling a demon for his own gain, Garm confessed his whole plan. While he was half expecting Caniva to degrade him for what Sumner would call his obtuse idea, Caniva did the opposite. Caniva confessed that he and the cult had desires to do something similar, only they had no access to a way of opening a door with enough energy to allow a true demonic lord to pass through. Caniva was ecstatic about the idea for the first week or so after learning it. So much so, he suggested to Garm that he and the Dark Circle would accompany him in the ritual. Garm was okay with this, but one small detail had halted this plan. The Dark Circle had no intention of binding and controlling the demon, only to release him and obey his every will. Garm considered this plan extremely foolish, especially after the vision he had. Scorn had crushed Garm before he even had the chance to say a word. Why would he spare the cult members? Caniva and Garm would never find an equate compromise to this point. Therefore, it was decided the Dark Circle would not intervene with the ritual, but they would not stop him either. Garm promised that once he had Scorn in his control, he would allow the cult to continue to exist independently. A promise he wasn't initially planning on keeping, but he convinced himself that using Scorn against the cult wouldn't gain him anything. Garm never shared any of his learning with anyone else. Not even the top men in his legion. He still had no intention to use such magic in his day-to-day, just for this one ritual. During his time with the cult, Garm learned many details about Scorn he wouldn't have known otherwise, such as his general history and family tree. Many of the higher cult members had spoken to Scorn personally in the past, either through meditation or seeing stones. In the past, Scorn had hopes that these mages could one day find it within themselves to release him from the confines of the underworld. While the cult would be loyal to Scorn, he was not their desired spirit for world domination. They believed Scorn would be able to conquer the Bannerlord, but not sustain his power for generations. They believed Prince of Hell, Caldera, would be a better fit. Again, Garm refused to compromise. This was mostly due to Garm's impatience. He had already delayed his ritual numerous months in order to be strong enough to bind Scorn. It would take many more to reach a level to control someone like Caldera. His pride was willing to compromise a little, but not that much. After over 7 months of periodic visits to Haines Haven and countless lessons, Garm felt confident enough to conduct the ritual. He didn't tell anyone, not Caniva, none in his legion, and certainly not Sumner. They would know when they needed to know. On the night of the ritual, Garm gathered his boots, collected his staff, and exited his citadel. Like before, Garm took periodic breaks on the way to Sumner's tower. Less than before, but enough for him to scold himself for stalling. This was his time. Why was he so nervous? When he reached the tower, Sumner was once again absent for the evening. Perfect. He reached the chamber just like before, lit the 2 torches near the lectern, and looked at the runestone circle. He quickly recited the runestone pattern in his head and began placing stones one by one. When it was time to place the last one, Garm took a deep breath and envisioned Scorn in his mind. He focused on the dark presence from his youth and his vision. His heart was pounding, but he wasn't afraid. He was the evil mage Garm. He could do this. He placed down the catalystone and the tower began to shake. Scorn's presence quickly returned and overwhelmed his being. He quickly controlled his nerves as black and red smoke began to pour from the gateway in the center of the circle. Before he knew it, there he was. The evil demon Scorn stared down at the tiny man. Garm's eyes began to glow yellow as he conjured a magical yellow shield around the demon prince. Scorn's confusion turned to seething anger as he pounded on the barrier. Even still, Scorn was extremely powerful. It took all of Garm's concentration to keep the barrier alight. Scorn shouted profanities at the young mage, exclaiming he would peel the flesh from his bones and tear him limb from limb. First, Garm tried to bend Scorn's will. Had this worked, Garm would have had complete control of Scorn's mind. However, this was unsuccessful. Scorn's will was simply too strong. Garm ended up resorting to a traditional binding spell. While this ritual could force Scorn to do whatever Garm demanded, Scorn was still a fully sentient individual. Scorn screamed as magical shackles formed around his wrist, visually confirming the binding was successful. Garm couldn't believe it. He had done it. The evil demon Scorn was his. Scorn's attempts to break free finally subsided as the demon lord crossed his arms and stared at the tiny man that dared enslave him. Scorn studied his captor and smiled to himself. Garm was a powerful mage, but Scorn could see he was arrogant, impatient, and prideful. Sure, he was powerful, enough to bind him, but it was only a matter of time before he slipped up. Scorn composed himself even further and asked Garm what he desired most. The world, Garm confessed. Given a moment to consider the situation, Scorn was actually quite happy with his response. Garm could use him to conquer the world, Garm would slip up eventually, and he would claim the world as his own. What Garm did not tell Scorn was that he confined the controllant of Scorn's binding spell to his staff, meaning whoever held Garm's staff controlled the demon lord. Scorn assumed it was something that Garm kept on his person at all times, but he wasn't sure as to what. Before Garm could fully express his plan to Scorn, the doors opened and an audible gasp was heard. Sumner had felt the rise in an unspeakable darkness and quickly rushed to return to his tower. Upon staring into the eyes of his brother and the unspeakable terror that loomed over him, Sumner raised his staff, called out Garm's name, and asked him what in the 8 realms he had done. Garm laughed before monologuing about Sumner's restrictions and fear of the dark side and whatnot. The ramblings really went through one ear and out the other for Sumner. It was nothing he hadn't heard before. A small part of Sumner was impressed. Garm had actually managed to summon and bind an archdemon without turning into a pulp stain, but he was more concerned with what this meant for the Bannerlord. Sumner tried to reason with Garm. He expressed that they could use Scorn for good. He was bound, and to unbind him now would be even worse, so they might as well use his magic to help others. Scorn could not be less interested in this exchange. He used his time to consider his cards and exactly how he would come out on top. He concluded he had no other choice but to play the long game and just see what happens. Sumner was making no progress with Garm. The evil mage was consumed by wrath and hatred for everyone. The peasants that dismissed him, those stuck-up Valkyrie and their snobby male counterparts, and certainly this old quack that sat before him. Sumner's argument wasn't exactly at the top of his game, mostly because he would have never believed his brother would go to this far to obtain power. Sumner found himself apologizing for everything, which only infuriated Garm more. Scorn's strategizing session was interrupted by Garm screaming for Sumner's execution. Garm attempted to slam his fist down on Sumner, but the Grand Wizard wasn't ready to give up so easily. He used the light shield to halt Scorn's hammering. Garm proceeded to blast his brother with purple lightning, while Scorn opened his chest, firing a laser death beam. Sumner probably could have withstood both of these individually, but not together. Sumner's shield broke as Garm was quick to scoop him up in his massive palm. The demon smiled as he held the defenseless wizard. Sumner screamed as Garm pelted him through the tower wall as he flew into the distance. Scorn's laughing was cut by Garm's nagging. "Find him," Garm barked. "He's dead," Scorn replied. "Find him," Garm repeated. Scorn grumbled under his breath and vanished through the portal he still sat within, while Scorn searched for any sign of Sumner. Garm returned to his citadel to address his legion. Garm expressed that Sumner had attempted to assassinate him for fearing his power and influence. He continued, saying that he had killed his older brother in self-defense, and it was time for the flag of Garm to reign across the Bannerlord. At no point did he mention Scorn or the possibility that Sumner could have survived. Scorn, traveling via the Earth mantle, searched in the general direction Sumner was thrown. As Scorn really didn't care to find him, his search was vague. Even if Sumner had survived, he clearly wasn't a threat to him. If he showed up again, he would just throw him even harder. Garm was disappointed by Scorn's inability to find the Grand Wizard, but he had relaxed enough to let it go for the time being. Ironically, Garm would find himself arguing with Scorn more frequently than he had with Sumner. The only difference was the binding spell kept Garm in the driver's seat. Their first major dispute started over the fate of the 13 runestones. Scorn was passionate that they should be scattered across the land, while Garm wanted to keep them to himself. Garm recognized Scorn's point to an extent. If in the right hands, they could be used against them. But Scorn left out his real concern. With the runestones, one could access the underworld. If he were to be banished back home, someone could use the runestones to follow him back, including Garm. So he really just wanted to cover his butt. This ended up being one of the few times they would compromise. Garm would move the 12 elemental stones to his citadel, while Scorn hid the 13th catalyst stone somewhere else. That way, Garm could fetch the stone if he wanted to use the stone, but it prevented just anyone from coming in and using them. Garm wanted to keep Scorn's involvement hidden from his legion, at least for the time being. Scorn was instructed to find a private place in the temple zone where Garm could reach him when need be. That place turned out to be the desecrated temple. As he likely would have done even without Garm, Scorn ripped it to shreds and sealed himself inside. Scorn melted down some holy artifacts to craft his golden armor. However, since Scorn did not have time nor the instruction to understand the world's elements, his weapons remained non-elemental. He would gain a general understanding of how fire and lightning worked in later years, but never enough to apply them to anything. And yes, he still kept the organist alive for some in-house entertainment. If Scorn was conquering the world on his own, he would likely have placed a loyal guardian in control of each realm to enforce his rule and protect a key to his stronghold. Garm's plan followed a similar structure, but had a few key distinctions. While Scorn would have numerous armies across multiple realms, Garm would use his legion as his prime enforcers. Due to the several months delay from the original ritual date, certain aspects of the Bannerlord had changed over that time. The Spire Island scientists had properly discontinued and disposed of the toxic slime experiment, meaning the plague fiend would never come to be. The would-be Spider Queen, Silva, would find herself ripped apart by a carnivorous plant before Garm or Scorn could find any use for her. Also, since Scorn never truly mastered elements, the Chimera and the Gargoyles would never come to exist. Some guardians, including the Genie, Yeti, and Dragon, would be mostly unchanged had Scorn made them on his own volition. The Lich was also reborn, but without an undead army to accompany him. He was also not given the Hand of the Damned. The Dream World, for the time being, would be completely uninvolved. Garm's plan was to storm each world one by one, with his legions crushing the population into submission. What Garm did not expect, however, was how much resistance he would face. Scorn tried to warn him, but Garm wouldn't have it. While Scorn had never been to the surface world before, he had connected with numerous individuals over the years, including members of the Dark Circle and Garm himself. Through these connections, Scorn was able to paint a fairly competent image of how this world functioned. He certainly wasn't an expert, but he knew it would take more than an army of non-elemental mortals to conquer this realm. Scorn would take jabs where he could, but he was more so just testing the waters regarding Garm's intelligence and sense of vision, both of which Scorn found to be extremely lacking in the young mage. Garm's first course of action was to secure a foothold in the temple zone. Scorn likely wouldn't have bothered with the locals of this province, but Garm wanted to ensure the safety of his citadel while his army was away. Garm's legion would smash the temporal freedom fighters before they even had a chance to properly form. News of this spread quickly to the neighboring realms of Mountain Kingdom, Forest Realm, and Twinian Province. As Garm was planning to invade Twinian Town, the Reaver cult reached out to him in order to form an alliance. This would be the only faction to willingly side with Garm's forces. With the Reavers, Blood Mages, the Legion, and the Lich, Garm's forces would lead a siege against Twinian Town. This resulted in a valiant uprising from the Witch Coven, leaving the townspeople stuck in between. At the same time, Scorn birthed the mighty dragon under the Mountain Kingdom, and the collapse of the Mountain Men would proceed with little change. The Northern Realms would catch rumor of this, but would assume Sumner would take care of it, or at least inform them if the situation was truly dire. However, that opinion waned in popularity over the following weeks as it became more and more apparent that Sumner was MIA. As the South plunged into war, the dwarven houses squabbled in their chambers and the desert magi prepared to send aid. However, Scorn released the genie before that could happen properly. The Knights of Sky proved to be the biggest thorn for Garm and Scorn. They assisted the Magi against the Jinn, fought for the war in Twinning Town, and assisted the Castle Stronghold's fight against the Lycan army. That still came to be. The Mountain Men had already scattered their forces by the time they had joined the fight proper. The Knights of Sky ended up accepting refugees from both of these worlds, much to Garm's chagrin. Garm spent the majority of the early war effort focusing on the Knights of Sky. His legion had no form of air force to combat their monstrous ships. First, Garm tried to lure them to the ground by attacking their ground bases. Spire Island was blown to hell by Scorn in an attempt to lure the Knights into a ground assault. It didn't work. In response, Garm had Scorn create a massive weather demon they called the Zeusian. It was essentially a sentient storm cloud. This spirit would take the role that the Plague Fiend would have. While the spirit was not able to disable the Knights of Sky as a faction, it did keep them occupied as it prevented them from landing and assisting other realms. The Zeusian was the only original plan of Garm's that Scorn didn't find completely stupid. Before the arrival of the Zeusian, the Knights of Sky were able to strongly alter the events of the Jinn attack on the Magi. While the Jinn were still able to take the city, most of the mages were able to escape and were spared. At the same time, the Forest Realm was plunged into a four-way war. The Elves, the Keepers, the Ints, and Garm's Legion was caught up in a free-for-all that spanned the realm's surface. Garm had woken the ancient Keepers that slept beneath the swamp, which was a good move in itself. But without an unrivaled authority figure like the Spider Queen, they just went nuts. Garm sent his legion in attempts to organize a planned assault against the Elves. Negotiations quickly went sideways as the Legionnaire Strategos was hit in the face with a rock. What turned into a tense conversation quickly escalated into a full-on battle between the Teporian soldiers and the Lizard People. Over the following months, Garm continued to instruct the Legionnaires present in the realm to not engage with the Keepers. But the Keepers didn't know that. Legion camps were constantly under ambush, making the invasion a complete bust. Even so, it wasn't nearly as pathetic as Garm's quote-unquote assault on the Ice Domain. Scorn had the Yeti created just the same, but instead of making a way to lure the dwarves out like Scorn would have done with the meteor, Garm figured the best plan was to have the Yeti lead a division of the Legion on foot through the Ice Domain in search of an entrance to the Dwarven city. Then they would ambush them. Scorn was amazed by this plan's stupidity, so much so that he didn't even protest. He was excited to see how terrible it would go. In fact, Scorn found himself doing this quite often. While he obviously enjoyed wreaking havoc on the innocents, he almost had more fun watching Garm lose. Scorn would always see the holes in Garm's plans, but held his tongue, just to see how terrible it went. Scorn only spoke up if Garm's incompetence put him at risk, but he encouraged plans that put Garm in danger. While Scorn basked in the idea of killing Garm himself, anything that would get him set free was acceptable. Within the first week of the Ice Domain campaign, men were already dropping to frostbite and exhaustion, and the Yeti was losing his patience. After finding nothing in 2 weeks and losing half their men due to the elements, the Legion troops insisted they abandon the mission. The Yeti denied them at every turn. After 3 days of defiance from his men, the Yeti was on the verge of losing it. The situation officially boiled over when a member of the Legion fired an arrow into the Yeti's back. The beast snapped. He roared and went berserk. Limbs and frozen blood went everywhere, and the Legion was torn apart. Garm completely lost contact with the snow beast after that. Of course, Scorn knew exactly where he was, but there was no point in informing Garm. He had other plans for him. A couple days later, the Yeti would stumble upon an entrance to the Dwarven city. After tripping a detector, the Yeti was swarmed by angry dwarves in seconds. He fought valiantly, but was soon brought to his knees by various weapons planted into his back. Lord Hera was the one to remove the monster's head. At no point did the dwarves link the Yeti attack to the war in the south, and they really had no reason to. Wild beasts were not unheard of in the Ice Domain. Ironically, the Yeti's little outbursts against the Legion troops likely kept the dwarves out of the war. Had the Yeti arrived with Garm's men, the dwarves likely would have connected the dots and declared this an act of war. Luckily for Garm, the Dwarven Parliament decided against joining the war. Scorn was inconvenienced by the Yeti's death, but his plan could do without him. Unbeknownst to Garm, Scorn had programmed his guardians to be loyal to him, not Garm, meaning, provided he escaped his shackles, Scorn already would have some allies in advance. After the first year of combat, the war did not look good for Garm. The only regions that they controlled were the Temple Zone, the Mountain Kingdom, and the Desert Land. They had active battlefronts in Twinning Town, Castle Stronghold, in the Forest Realm, neither of which were going well for them. And there was some regions like the Sky Dominion and Ice Domain in which they had no presence at all. The Zeusian was more proficient in keeping the Knights of Sky from intervening on the surface, but it wasn't able to properly cause damage within their ranks. Also, by this point, most of the Legion was aware of Scorn's involvement. Some of them were outraged and abandoned the war, but most didn't. Most assumed Garm had a very good reason for working with an archdemon, which was mostly true. A few months into the second year, a group of rebels in the Temple Zone were able to take back Sumner's tower. Garm was using the tower's gateways to transport his Legion troops across the Bannerlords. Garm scrambled to get a division to retake the tower, but he couldn't without risking one of the active battlefronts, so he sent Scorn to deal with it personally. While Scorn burned the rebels into ash no problem, he wasn't exactly careful in his conquest. Much of the tower was damaged in his rampage, which blocked access to most of the realm's gates, including the entirety of the West Wing and the Twinion Town Gate. Of course, those were the gates Garm needed the most. Now, he was restricted to using the tower to reach only his own territories, aka Mountain and Desert. The Legion was running dangerously low on both men and supplies. After several more months of continuous losses, Garm had no choice but to withdraw the Legion from the war. Considering Garm's army was their central force, this changed the war front drastically. This forced Scorn to liquidate his other forces to fill in the gaps. What was a stalemate in Twinion Town quickly became advantageous to the witches. Garm responded by splitting the Lycan army to assist Twinion Town, but this left the assault on the castle stronghold lacking. This pattern repeated everywhere. Scorn was actually quite amazed by this. Here was a man that was one of the most powerful mages of his time. He had complete control over an archdemon, Sumner was nowhere to be found, and Garm was still somehow losing. Scorn assumed Garm didn't know exactly how powerful his demon pet truly was. Sure, Scorn made him some monsters, killed some insurgents, and threw an old man through a wall, but he really didn't do anything drastic. In order to settle the forest, Garm made Scorn cast a spell on the Keepers, making them his loyal drones. This was Garm's first good idea in months, and it resulted in the domination of the forest realm. The elves were forced from the treetops as they went into hiding. They put up a good fight, but the Keepers outnumbered them, and with them working in unity, it was only a matter of time. Meanwhile, Twinion Town was both literally and figuratively on fire, but before the Knights of Sky had to pull out of the war, they returned the Book of Protection to the witches. This allowed them to engage and kill the Lich. Since Gulch didn't have an army he could control from his crypt, he had to fight actively on the front lines. When the Legion pulled out, the Reaver cult quickly began to struggle. They stood no chance against the Coven on their own. When they requested aid, Garm split the Lycan army to assist the cult, leaving their offense weakened at the castle stronghold. Things began to quickly crumble for Garm after that. The Valkyries were able to defeat the Lycan invaders and assist the Knights of Sky by slaying the Zeusian. Garm was seething. It all came to a head when the now freed Knights of Skies dropped a mine on Garm's citadel. While the runestones were unharmed, they were buried under a pile of debris. Garm retaliated by sending the dragon to attack the castle stronghold. This left the Mountain Kingdom open to attack from the Mountain Men. Unfortunately, Korik was not present for this assault. He was killed attempting to reach Mortal after the first attack. Since Sumner was not there to save him, Korik died there and then. His younger brother, Prince Maverick, was crowned in his stead. While the Mountain Men were not able to fully take back their home in the dragon's absence, the Orc force was severely weakened. Also, since Garm started spending less and less time at the desecrated temple, the Organist wasn't able to just craft the Soul Savior, but inform the allies. A plane belonging to the Knights of Sky picked up the Organist, Soul Savior, and 13th Runestone in hand. He was taken to a now Lycan-free castle stronghold where the majority of the refugees were hiding out. Recognizable characters would include Khan, the Last Kantani, Cirrus, the Yellow Wizard, and Sumner. Yes! After flying Air Scorn, Sumner landed several thousand yards from his tower. While he wasn't mortally wounded, he was in no shape physically or mentally to face his brother and the demon again. Sumner called upon Freya of the castle stronghold to rescue him from the crash. Ironically, Scorn would have found him had he looked a little harder. Physically he was fine, but the onslaught of such dark energy from both Garm and Scorn, Sumner needed time to recover mentally and rid himself of the darkness he was exposed to. This ended up taking longer than he thought. The war and the rising darkness certainly didn't help, but Sumner didn't sit idly. Well, Depends who you ask. Sumner spent weeks arguing in the Dwarven Parliament, but even he could not get them to look past their own personal vendettas. There was a few key reasons why the dwarves did not join the war effort on the surface. The biggest being a series of ultimately trivial events involving some personal feelings and political corruption, resulting in the dismantlement of an entire Dwarven house. Even after hearing it from all parties involved, Sumner still couldn't get a clear picture. Apparently some Dwarven princess said something about a Dwarven senator, and now everyone is throwing eggs at each other. There was a lot of, well, I'm not going to vote for it if so-and-so was voting for it. Even most of the dwarves didn't know what they were angry about, but they wanted to appease their friends in higher places, most of which were very passionate about whatever had happened. Either way, the Dwarven Senate was frozen, and Garm's Continental War was just happened to land during this period. Even with Sumner calling for a vote over 15 times, he just could not get a majority to recognize the threat Garm and Scorn proposed. Sumner's mission in the Undercities wasn't completely pointless, however. He managed to leave with about 100 dwarves from House Kadesh. House Kadesh was dealing with a whole other family affair, and most of the members just wanted a distraction. And with a war on the surface, why not? They had to promise that they couldn't join as representatives of House Kadesh, the Ice Domain, or members of the Dwarven government. Even though they had to enlist as individuals, everyone knew what was going on. After a quick discussion, the Kadesh dwarves swapped their red markings for blue markings and joined Freya and the forces of the castle stronghold. This was partially because the dwarves were curious if they still had the Ice Axe of Antar, which they did. But it was mostly because Freya seemed to be the most eager to fight alongside dwarves. Sumner also attempted to get in contact with the Dream World, but since the tower was captured and the House of Forgotten Dreams in the middle of a war zone, he decided to hold off on the idea. What nobody was accounting for was the defectors within Garm's ranks. Members of his legion, both after and during their withdrawal, would rebuke the flag of the evil mage and in some cases assist the so-called Rebel Alliance. The number that actually left the army was rather small, less than 50. The majority of the turncoats operated from within Garm's circle. Some gave false reports, some sabotaged operations intentionally, but the majority would just simply not relay information. Scorn was very well aware of this, and strategically, he should have told Garm, and he recognized that. But watching Garm's world crumble around him was just too enjoyable for the Archdemon. He could not bring himself to let Garm win, even if it was in his own best interest. However, Garm's mind was completely slipping away, and Scorn was taking notice. Finally, after 2 years of forced servitude, Scorn began to put his escape plan into action. As long as Scorn was under Garm's spell, he couldn't hurt him directly, but it never said anything about someone else doing it. Scorn was hoping more of his guardians would have survived the prior 2 years of combat. He believed that the Lich, Yeti, and Zeusien would still be alive if Garm was a bit better strategist, but the genie and dragon should be enough. If everything went well, Scorn would have had the genie and dragon ambush Garm during one of his moments of incoherity. The biggest hurdle for Scorn wouldn't actually come from Garm or any of the allies, but rather one of his own guardians. While the genie was loyal to Scorn to an extent, Scorn had no way of enforcing the Jinn under his own control. When Garm explained his mission to the surviving servants, the genie agreed to take part only if it was done in the desert lands. While it seemed like stubbornness for the sake of stubbornness, Shaitan had a fairly decent point. The Jinn's power sourced from the natural energy of the desert realm. Had he left the realm, the genie would be weakened. Not enough to impair him, of course, but Shaitan argued he should be at the top of his game if they were to take down the Arc Wizard. Scorn recognized his point, but he was still fuming over it. Not so much at the genie in particular, but rather the idea that he had to convince Garm to go to the desert lands with them. Scorn would stage it under the guidance of a strategy meeting in which the genie wanted to take part. Garm didn't go easily. He told Scorn to go and just bring back the results. But since there was no meeting, Spell didn't obligate Scorn to go, so he continued to protest. This defiance should have made Garm smell the blood in the water, and a year ago he probably would have. But at this point in his mental state, Garm caved and met up with Scorn at the desert realm. One of the moles mentioned earlier overheard this conversation. Honestly, with their constant bickering, it was impossible not to. This defector leaked their plan to meet in the desert lands. The message telephoned its way through the allies all the way up to Sumner. Details were lost in translation, but it was enough to get the picture. While this message was going through the chain of command, Garm lost any standing he had in Twinian Town. The allies, including the Knights of Sky, Castle Valkyrie, and Kadesh dwarves, were able to assist the witches in their defense. With the Lich gone, the Legion withdrawn, and the cult's numbers dwindling, they had no choice but to surrender. Kaniva and Din Castlefang, the true leader of the cult, were both captured along with any other surviving members. Kaniva in particular was taken to the castle stronghold. Kaniva was an open book during his interrogation. He truly had no reason to lie. He wasn't loyal to Garm, simply seizing an opportunity for power. While Kaniva was loyal to Scorn, that was never brought up. In order to avoid a death penalty, Kaniva explained exactly what he had taught Garm in their time together. It wasn't anything Sumner and Cirrus were not familiar with, but it would help him to prepare in advance. Kaniva also confirmed that the Desert Lands meetup was indeed happening before he was placed in the Dungeon of Torment along with others. Despite the name, they were treated fairly, but the Reaver cult was officially off the board. Scorn found out pretty quickly, but he didn't care that much. If his plan worked, it wouldn't matter. And Garm, well, he didn't need to know. Speaking of what Garm didn't need to know, Scorn didn't tell him all his forces were coming to the meeting. To be more specific, all of Scorn's forces, especially without the cult, this wasn't much. The Jinn army, most of the mountain orcs, fragments of the Lycan army, and the Keepers still under Scorn's spell. He also brought the dragon, who Garm was also not expecting to meet. Scorn's plan was pretty simple. They would meet in the city, and Scorn would have everyone attack Garm at once. But what he was not accounting for was the allies showing up. The allies had no idea this meeting was a ploy to get Garm killed. Everyone was under the impression this was a genuine strategy pitch. Scorn and the genie were the only two that knew this was a trap. The dragon wasn't initially aware, but as he was loyal to Scorn, he wouldn't be a problem. All of Garm's forces were arriving at Impera when the allies ambushed them. The Knights of Sky, Castle Valkyrie, surviving Magi mages, Kadesh dwarves, temporal rebels, and the Lost Carnival? With the liberation of Twinian Town, Sumner went to the Dream World via the House of Forgotten Dreams. The Dream Spirits were aware of a conflict in the overworld, but they were not clear on the details, just that there was fighting. The Dream World up to this point was completely uninvolved in the Bannerman War, but that did not mean they were not influenced. As the war progressed, the Dream World appeared darker and less fun to the locals. It wasn't exactly explainable, nor was it obvious, but the population could agree that something wasn't right. Storms were more frequent, the sky felt dark, and screams from the haunted house echoed across the surrounding grounds. Little did they know that most of the screams were real. Some of them were the Dream World expressing itself, but most were the meals of the void. During the war in Twinian Town, unexpected legionnaires and Lycans wandered into the abandoned mansion to the east. Little did they know the house belonged to two worlds. The void, the monster, not the portal, didn't take kindly to such intruders, and you can probably picture what happened next. Either way, spirits were on edge. The Lawless Land would have been more involved had Scorn taken over directly, but it wasn't like the Carnival staff was comfortable with Garm's war either. Even so, most of the spirits didn't want to get involved, at least until the Jester explained it in his own way. The Carnival Major expressed that the Desert Lands would be very crowded with visitors from all parts of the world, the perfect place for a show. This instantly got the staff on board. They weren't exactly taking part in a battle, but more so putting on a show in a crowded area that happened to be prone to fighting. When all the allies attacked Impera, Garm and his forces were completely unprepared. Before Scorn had a chance to spring the trap on his master, the city shook as airships, void portals, and freedom fighters surrounded the desert city. Scorn looked at the sky. His voice boomed over the fighting. He told the allies that they had landed right into his trap, and they would all be destroyed. This did disorient some of the allies, but there was no merit to it. Scorn was just as surprised as everyone else. But if he could pull off this plan, it wouldn't matter. What did annoy him, though, was Garm, who began shouting at Scorn to destroy them all. Still under the spell, Scorn had to leave Garm unattended in the streets to assist in the surrounding battle. Scorn picked up a piece of building and hurled it into the nearest airship. He laughed as that explosion blanketed its interior, causing the ship to nosedive toward the ground. His laughter was cut short by the sound of a distinct laser blast. He turned around to see the genie had engaged with Garm. He told the genie to attack on his signal, but Scorn never declared what such signal would be. So when a massive airship exploded over the city, the genie fired on the unexpected wizard. In other circumstances, the genie wouldn't be able to stand against the evil mage Garm. But amongst the chaos of battle and the mage's declining mental state, the Jinn was able to get the jump on him. While the blast from his eye beam wouldn't significantly hurt Garm, it would launch him into a wall, separating him from his staff. Only Garm knew Scorn's spell was bounded to the staff, but he was more concerned about defending himself from the genie, and later the dragon, to retrieve it. Scorn screamed for his forces to attack Garm. Truthfully, the allies had no idea what was happening. One second they were in a battle against the forces of evil, and the next the leaders of the opposition seemed to be fixated on one man in the center of their ranks. Garm, despite his position, was holding his own. Not enough to escape the situation, but enough to not die. He was now fully aware what was going on. Scorn was trying to pull a fast one on him, but if he could use the spell, and Garm's heart sank when he looked over to see some fool in tights hurling his staff around like a baton. The Jester danced as his allies began to break through the forces. The Jester covered his ears with another eye beam from the genie. "Oh, make it stop. Do please make it stop," said the Jester. The clown's snickering turned into hysteric laughter as Scorn's fist connected with the genie's head. The Jester didn't know he held Scorn's control rod. In fact, no one did apart from Garm. "Get him! Get him!" the Jester cheered, still unaware of the power he held. Scorn was seconds from spreading Garm's face against the pavement when the spell overtook him once again, but not from the greedy young mage. Even after he slugged his blue ally, Scorn still struggled to connect the dots. It wasn't until the line, "blow his head up," did Scorn and the genie know exactly what was going on. The dragon halted his assault on Garm to watch as Scorn opened his chest and blasted the gym leader with a light cannon. The genie's scream was cut short when he was blown to bits in front of everyone. The dragon backed up into a defensive position, not sure what just happened. The Jester clapped and whistled loudly, thanking Scorn for a great show. The archdemon stared at the tiny man that held his leash. "Who are you?" Scorn asked. "I am your father," the Jester replied before losing his composure to his own joke. While the dream major was distracted, Scorn searched for Garm, who had fled in the chaos. Scorn roared in anger and threw his fist through a building in search of Garm. "Hey!" screamed the Jester. "Uncalled for. Clean that up." The Jester looked down at the staff in astonishment as Scorn began to reconstruct the building with his magic. Before the Jester could finish his devilish grin, Summoner pulled the staff from his hands. The Jester protested but was quickly silenced by the Grand Wizard, who held the Soul Saver in his other. Scorn turned around as Summoner called his name. Scorn growled. Any shock he may have had was overtaken by rage. Garm, who watched from the shadows, seeing his brother alive and well, killed any sense of sanity left in him. Garm emerged from the shadows, shouting and screaming at his brother. The idea he had defeated Summoner, even if he had cheated, was really the only thing keeping him going. Even if he lost the war, lost control of Scorn, his home, and essentially everything else, at least he disposed of that tired, nagging old man. But apparently, he didn't even accomplish that much. Garm said nothing as he poured all his remaining energy into bringing down his brother. Summoner absorbed Garm's attempts fairly easily and pushed him aside. Valkyries surrounded and restrained Garm as he screamed and fought until he physically couldn't continue. Garm's internal pain was so intense even the Jester couldn't find it in himself to crack a smile. Summoner looked at Garm's pulsing eyes. He wanted to believe there was still some shiver of light left in his younger sibling, but he just couldn't see it. Any resemblance of a good man had been consumed by this power-hungry monster he had become. Summoner sighed at his brother, shook his head, and met Scorn's gaze. Scorn stared coldly through his mask. Garm was an angry child. At no point did the demon fear him, but Summoner terrified the Prince of Hell. Scorn remained motionless as Summoner waved Garm's staff. After getting his instructions, Scorn snapped his finger, and just like that, the war was over. The Lycans felt a painful surge before they fell limp. The Jinn cried out as their golem bodies melted into nothing. The Keepers ran for the hills as flames began to consume their backs. The dragon fell backward as his body began to liquefy into molten lava. Scorn held his composure as his servants died around him. The cheers of the allies could be heard over the city ruins. Summoner told Scorn he would fix everything he had broken, and he would be banished to the underworld, never to return. Considering Summoner could have put him to death, Scorn was semi-happy with this outcome. Honestly, Scorn didn't have that much to fix. The desert city of Tempura, which took about a day, a few airships here and there, the village of Twinning Town, and the desecrated temple. Until he was forced to repair it, Scorn didn't realize what little damage he and Garm had done on a big scale. Looking back, Scorn wished he had been more involved in the war front. During his community service sentence, Scorn found it worse than had Summoner killed him on the spot, but he did have plenty of time to think. He still blamed Garm for all of this. He wouldn't mind going back to the underworld as long as he had Garm with him. If he could make Garm pay for this for the rest of eternity, he would be content with that. He would get another chance one day. If there was anything Scorn was unexpectedly good at, it was playing the long game. When the banner was breathing again, Summoner used the Soul Saver and banished Scorn from the realm. He also freed Scorn from his shackles by smashing Garm's staff. Summoner couldn't help but be impressed by his brother's spell work. If not for his greed and his pride, Garm could have been the best of them. Before his banishment, Scorn pleaded for Summoner to surrender Garm to him. He argued that no punishment would be better fit for his crimes. A very tiny part of Summoner wanted to see Garm suffer, but no. If he gave his brother to a demon to be tortured for all eternity, he would be no better than Garm. Summoner had Garm locked in the Dungeon of Torment, and the runestones retrieved from the remains of his citadel. Yeah, Summoner didn't bother having Scorn fix that. Ironically, the Banorns as a whole saw Scorn as a victim in all this. To the average person, from their perspective, they saw Garm's forces storm and destroy their home, and then a so-called Prince of Hell coming in to fix it. Some argued that Scorn probably would have done worse had he had the opportunity, but since that didn't happen, they can only speculate. What would have been a year and a half of war and 9 years of oppression under Scorn ended up being 2.5 years of war under Garm. Despite the war lasting twice as long under Garm, the Allies suffered less casualties than they would have in a single year under Scorn. The world also healed much faster. The lost were honored and the dead buried, but it was done. The Bannerlord was saved. New relations formed amongst the realms as well. The castle population loved the Kadesh Dwarves, and by extension, the Dwarven race, for their sacrifice and their call to action. The Kadesh Dwarves prevented what would have been backlash for the Dwarven military not joining the war. But to the average person, the Dwarves did fight in the war. Most people weren't keen to exactly how massive the Dwarven cities are. In other terms, the Kadesh Dwarves kept their realm's reputation in good standing. The Dwarven government, despite declaring to not join, would honor House Kadesh for their fine display of Dwarven strength and bravery. The Reaver cult was essentially purged from the face of the earth. After word got out that they not only helped Garm, but taught him how to capture and enslave a demon, people were outraged. The townsfolk of both Haven and Twinian Town rounded up the survivors and put them to death. The witches didn't publicly endorse this, but they did. The only survivor was Keniva, as he was in the Dungeon of Torment. He, like Garm, would spend the rest of their days behind bars in the Cistern Dungeon for their crimes against the Bannerlord. Sumner would never visit Garm in prison. His brother was dead. Only an angry, hateful, rotting husk remained. Scorn would never get the chance to inflict his revenge against Garm. His siblings in the underworld frequently reminded him of his shortcomings. To the Bannerlord at large, Scorn was seen as a victim, and to the underworld, he was the loser that couldn't escape the binding of a silly small frog mage. This humiliation was almost worse than death to Scorn. While he swore revenge against Sumner and the Bannerlord, that day would never come for him. He would never lose his mind as Garm had, but his ego was heavily damaged by the constant reminders of his failure and the events playing in his head over and over again. He put on a good face in front of the other demon, as if none of it got to him, but it did. After decades of this, it got to the point where Scorn didn't believe he could take back the Bannerlord, even if he got another chance, so he never attempted. But the opportunity never arose, so it didn't matter too much anyway. Realms of the Bannerlord strengthened as a result of the war. Twinian Town didn't evolve much, but mages that practiced blood magic were executed rather than banished to prevent another cult uprising in the future. These characters were beheaded, cleansed, then burned to ensure they'd never return. The Mountain Kingdom was rebuilt under King Maverick, and a temple was built in honor of the fallen kings Trian and Korik. Due to the lack of time, the dragon and his forces never had the opportunity to properly build a volcanic kingdom under the volcano, meaning the orc forces remained relatively unorganized. They attempted an uprising once under surviving orc boss Burnch the Destroyer, but were quickly crushed and surrendered with Burnch's death at the hands of King Maverick. The Forest Realm suffered the most damage, but with the bulk of the keepers dying in the final battle, the elves were able to properly retake their lands. Since the realm was the last to be liberated, the elves never had a chance to properly help other realms, and thus stayed out of the war proper. Theris and the surviving members of the Magi took on the task to rebuild their ranks. By the time the Thunder Space War had started, they had about 25,000, which is more than they would have had at this point had Scorn led the war. Since the Knights of Sky were never purged, they never had to rebuild their ranks with impure knights. With the Order remaining pure during the Thunder Space War, the Sentinels of Log didn't get nearly as far to the surface. Instead of lasting 2 years, the Thunder Space War barely lasted 6 months. With Frank Loyal taking his place as king of the castle stronghold, the Bannerlord could now enter a new era of everlasting peace. And that, mighty heroes, is our story. Thank you for getting this far. I wanted to take a route that kept Garm in charge the whole time, because if Scorn had broke free at any point, he would have just killed him and it would have just been Dark Legacy all over again. So yeah, tell me what you thought and give me suggestions and other stories like this one. Fare thee well, heroes.